We continue this Sunday to read through John chapter 6, which is the Bread of Life discourse. And Jesus moves from the first part of the Bread of Life discourse, where he talks about faith in him and believing. And he begins to emphasize eating the bread of life, that we must eat and consume the bread of life, despite the murmuring from the crowds. And as we look at our first reading today, I think it can teach us a few things about reception of the Eucharist, because it foreshadows the Eucharist. You know, in the first reading, Elijah, who was a prophet of the Lord, was fleeing from the queen Jezebel. And Jezebel had killed all the other prophets, and she was now trying to kill Elijah. And so he flees into the desert, and he's basically at the point of complete and total exhaustion. And so he sees this tree there, and he goes and crawls under the tree, and he prays for death. And that's when an angel appears to him, and this miraculous food and water appears, and the angel says to him to eat. And he does that, and then it happens a second time. And after he eats this miraculous food, he's strengthened to walk 40 days and 40 nights through the desert to get to Mount Sinai. You know, if this food, this miraculous food that was given to Elijah, could have that effect on him, if it could strengthen him to walk 40 days and 40 nights and take him from the point of, basically giving up on life to fill him with energy. And the Eucharist is greater than the bread that Elijah ate. How much more should the Eucharist transform us? You know, the effects that the Eucharist has on us should be far more dramatic than the effects that we see on the prophet Elijah. But an important part of that is our disposition. And if we look at the disposition of Elijah, he was completely exhausted, and he had no strength left. He had nothing of his own that he could rely upon. It was entirely the Lord who supplied for him the strength that he needed. A few centuries ago, there was a massive army that was preparing to attack a town in Italy. And as the army was mobilizing, there was this convent right out in front of the town. And the convent was called San Damiano. And the soldiers, before they attacked the city, decided to pillage and attack this convent. And so the soldiers were scaling the walls and flooding into the cloister. And the nuns were terrified. And they ran to their mother superior, who was sick and in bed. And she had basically no strength left. And, as she was laying there in bed and the sisters were in a panic telling her what was going on, she dragged herself out of bed and she knelt down before the Eucharist. And the Eucharist in that convent, it was held in this silver and ivory container. And she knelt down in front of the Eucharist, and she said, "Lord, protect these your handmaids, who I cannot now save." She knew that she could do nothing to protect her sisters. And so she knelt down and pleaded with our Lord. And as she did that, she heard the voice of Jesus speak to her from the Eucharist. And he said, "I will always protect you." And so she picked up this monstrance that held the Eucharist, and her sisters, when they saw the Mother Superior get up and pick up the Eucharist, they rallied next to her, and she went out and holding the Eucharist and confronted the army. And as this army looked up and saw her coming out with the Eucharist and, the sisters next to her, their hearts were filled with fear, and they actually turned around and fled. The entire army, thousands and thousands of soldiers, fled from the convent, and they didn't attack the convent anymore, and they didn't attack the city. The mother in that story is now known as St. Clare of Assisi, and her feast day is actually today. Today's the feast day of St. Clare. But if we look at these two examples, both in the case of the prophet Elijah and in the case of St. Clare, they teach us how to approach the Eucharist, because in both cases, neither of them were depending upon their own strength. They were turning to the Lord in a moment of weakness, with complete and total trust and dependence upon God, not on their own strength. If we approach the Eucharist as if we're fine and as if we don't need anything, then we're not going to open ourselves up to receive much grace. And sometimes we do that. We're just in the habit of coming to church and it's like, okay, we're just going through the motions, and there's no room in us that we're making for the transformation of grace. When we come before the Eucharist, we need to come before the Lord in our weakness and in our brokenness. And what does that look like? Well, maybe there's some sinful habit that we're struggling with. Our language or some behavior that we're struggling with, and we just can't seem to break the habit. When we come before the Lord and say, Lord, I cannot overcome this sin by myself. I can't do it. I need your power and your grace to do it. That opens us up to receive the power of the Eucharist. Or if there's some suffering that we face, some trial in our life or some illness, when we come before the Lord and say, Lord, I do not have the strength to do this. I need your help. Or when we recognize our own sins and we say, Lord, I cannot make reparation for the sins that I've committed. I've done things against your will. I've harmed others. I've sinned against you. And I can't make up for that. But you can. It's when we come before the Lord in our weakness that the Lord shows the strength of his power. St. Clare once said, we become what we love, and who we love shapes what we become. We become what we love, and who we love shapes what we become. She would spend a lot of time in the presence of the Eucharist. And it was that time in the presence of the Eucharist that she learned to love the Lord more deeply, and it shaped her. It increased her desire and her trust in God. And the same happens to us if we have the right disposition and we place ourselves in the presence of the Lord, especially when we acknowledge that we desperately need him. We need a relationship with him, and we need his love to make us whole. And so as we reflect upon the gift of the Eucharist that Jesus teaches us in today's gospel, the people murmured against him. They didn't come before him with faith. But we look to the example of Elijah the prophet. We look to the example of St. Clare to teach us how we should come before the Lord with deep humility, recognizing our brokenness and our need for the Lord to transform us. And when we do that, our Lord will show forth his power and his strength through our weakness.